In a world that often judges far too swiftly, a world where the glittering superficial sheen of appearances can tragically, and with alarming frequency, overshadow the profound, often meticulously hidden, substance of true, unadulterated character, we are, on rare, precious, and illuminating occasions, confronted with stories that accomplish far more than merely entertaining or momentarily distracting us from our daily concerns. These are narratives of such piercing clarity, such resonant truth, that they jolt us from our societal slumber, our comfortable complacencies, compelling us, almost demanding us to look closer, to listen more intently, to feel with a depth that may have become unfamiliar. They are chronicles that serve as potent, unforgettable reminders of the quiet, unassuming dignity that can reside, like a hidden jewel, within the most unexpected of individuals. They speak of the unseen, uncelebrated, often arduous sacrifices made in the quiet, unlit shadows of everyday existence. And they reveal the profound, almost startling, and deeply humbling heroism that can blossom in the most uncultivated of souls, often flourishing in those very individuals whom society, in its haste and its blindness, has been conditioned to overlook, to undervalue, or to dismiss entirely. Today, we bring you one such extraordinary, multifaceted story, a chronicle that promises to resonate long after its final words are spoken, echoing in the chambers of memory, and perhaps, just perhaps, subtly altering the lens through which we view those around us. It is a story intricately woven from the coarse, abrasive threads of deeply ingrained, often unacknowledged, societal prejudice, the unyielding, almost defiant strength of human perseverance in the face of adversity, and the ultimate, irrefutable, almost blinding power of a truth so luminous, so undeniably authentic, that it possessed the inherent force to silence an entire room previously filled to the brim with the cacophony of cynical whispers, casual cruelties, and hardened, preconceived judgments. And in achieving this silence, this sudden, astonished stillness, it brought an entire community, unified in a moment of sudden, almost disbelieving recognition, spontaneously, collectively, to its feet. This remarkable, transformative journey, as is so often the case with pivotal moments that redefine the trajectory of human existence, began amidst the outward conventional trappings of celebration, achievement, and societal approval. A university graduation ceremony, a day ostensibly marked on the calendar for unbridled joy, heartfelt congratulations, and the optimistic embrace of forward-looking promise. But for one young woman, Lena Harper, a person of keen intellect and quiet sensitivity, this day, anticipated with a complex, swirling amalgam of justifiable pride in her accomplishments and a deeply rooted trepidation regarding its social undercurrents, was about to transform, quite unexpectedly, into an unforeseen, unscripted crucible. It would become a profound, intensely personal test of her own carefully cultivated resilience, her innate capacity for empathy and forgiveness, and in its dramatic, almost theatrical unfolding, it would spectacularly, unforgettably reveal a hero who had walked steadfastly, silently, almost invisibly beside her, his true, immeasurable worth veiled from the unseeing eyes of many for the entirety of her formative, impressionable years, shaping her in ways neither of them had perhaps fully comprehended until this very day. The very air within the hallowed, sun-drenched, almost cathedral-like expanse of the grand reception hall of Northwood University seemed to vibrate with a unique, almost palpable energy, a tangible amalgamation of hard-won triumph, youthful aspiration, and the collective sigh of relief from years of academic rigor. It was an atmosphere thick, almost heavy, with a complex bouquet of intermingled scents, the delicate, sweet perfume of thousands of freshly cut flowers, roses, lilies, and orchids, adorning each meticulously arranged, linen-draped table, The subtle yet distinctively expensive fragrances worn by proud parents, distinguished alumni, and esteemed faculty members, and the almost tangible, invisible aroma of collective achievement, of dreams realized and futures about to be launched. Graduation day, a significant, luminous, and often emotionally charged threshold in the lives of the young men and women who had toiled, sacrificed, and persevered for years, sometimes against considerable odds, to reach this coveted pinnacle of academic success. For most present, it was undeniably a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a sunburst of unrestrained relief and bubbling excitement, a well-deserved launching pad into a future that seemed, in that golden afternoon light, to be cryogene with the brightest hues of promise and boundless opportunity. But for Lena Harper, a strikingly intelligent, newly minted graduate, her recently awarded, embossed diploma clutched perhaps a little too tightly, a little too self-consciously, in her slender hand, that pervasive, celebratory joy felt akin to a delicate, intricately spun glass ornament, undeniably beautiful, certainly, a testament to her diligence, but also terrifyingly, precariously fragile, susceptible to shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces with the slightest misstep, the faintest ill wind of social awkwardness, or the careless utterance of a single ill-chosen word. It was a joy perpetually, almost predictably, laced with a persistent, gnawing undercurrent of tension, a familiar, unwelcome disquiet that seemed to follow her like an inseparable, unwelcome shadow, subtly dimming the brilliance of her own hard-won, well-deserved success. A shadow cast not by her academic journey, which had been stellar, but by the far more treacherous, unpredictable terrain of her social navigation, particularly within the complex, often judgmental ecosystem of her extended family. Beside her, a quiet, steadfast, almost grounding presence in the swirling, sometimes overwhelming currents of the reception's social dynamics, stood Malcolm Harper, her stepfather. He was by nature a man of few, always carefully chosen words, his natural reticence and thoughtful pauses often tragically mistaken for aloofness, disinterest, or even a lack of intellect by those who didn't bother to look beyond the surface, by those who valued glib pronouncements over considered silence. But for Lena, who knew the deep, calm waters that ran beneath his still surface, his presence was an unwavering, unshakable anchor in the often turbulent, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel waters of her young life. There was absolutely no ostentation, no artifice, no hint of self-importance about Malcolm. He harbored no desire whatsoever to draw attention to himself, seeming almost to prefer the comfortable anonymity of the background. His attire, while meticulously neat, freshly pressed, and entirely respectful of the occasion, bore no ostentatious designer labels, no symbols of affluence that might have garnered a nod of approval from the more status-conscious attendees. His voice, when he spoke, was invariably gentle, modulated, never booming across a room to demand an audience or assert dominance. Instead, what emanated from him, as consistently and reliably as the warmth from a hearth, was a steady, almost tangible kindness, a quiet, unassuming strength that Lena had come to rely on more than she often admitted, even to herself, a strength that was not about physical power, but about an unyielding moral core. This intrinsic warmth, this deep-seated goodness, was most profoundly evident, most clearly articulated, not in words, but in the way his gaze, deep, kind, and infinitely patient, rested upon Lena. A look filled with an immense, unarticulated, almost reverent pride. A father's profound, quiet satisfaction in his child's achievements that needed no grandiloquent pronouncements, no public displays of affection, no performative gestures to affirm its profound sincerity. It was a pride that was simply, unalterably there. A constant, reassuring, almost subliminal hum beneath the surface of his quiet, observant demeanor. A silent, unwavering testament to his unshakable belief in her abilities, her character, and her future. A belief that had often been the bedrock of her own self-confidence when it faltered. Lena, acutely, almost painfully, attuned to the subtle, often invisible shifts in social atmospheres, a highly developed skill, a kind of emotional radar, honed by years of navigating the complex, often fraught, dynamics of her extended family, particularly her mother's side. Felt the change in the room's energy before any overt sign, any spoken word, was given. It was a familiar, unwelcome chill, an almost imperceptible yet deeply felt drop in the room's ambient temperature that only she, it seemed, was capable of registering with such acuity. It was accompanied by a sudden, unwelcome, and all too familiar tightening in her chest, a physiological premonition of the discomfort, the subtle humiliations that were invariably, almost ritualistically, linked to any prolonged encounters with one particular formidable branch of her sprawling family tree, her mother's side. The Crowleys, the name itself in Lena's internal lexicon, often felt heavy, almost leaden, laden with years of unspoken judgments, thinly veiled criticisms, and a long, painful history of subtle, and sometimes shockingly not so subtle condescension. A condescension directed primarily, and most woundingly, towards Malcolm and by inevitable, painful extension, towards her, for her deep, unwavering, and unapologetic affection for him, an affection they seemed to view as a puzzling, almost embarrassing aberration. The whispers, insidious, sharp, and expertly aimed, began almost immediately upon their perceived arrival within the territorial vicinity of the Crowley contingent, who, with a predictability that was almost comical, had strategically positioned themselves near the lavish, overflowing refreshment buffet, as if to survey their rightful domain, their expressions a mixture of boredom and critical assessment. These whispers, though ostensibly kept at a low conspiratorial volume, seemed to possess an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to slither, like unseen, venomous serpents, through the otherwise celebratory, joyful hum of the hall. They were like tiny, precisely targeted, poison-tipped darts, finding their mark with cruel, unerring, and practiced precision, each one designed to inflict a small, almost invisible wound. They were for Lena, the inescapable, discordant background noise to so many of her family gatherings, a constant, grating reminder of the vast, seemingly unbridgeable chasm that existed between her mother's affluent, relentlessly image-conscious, and often superficial relatives, and the quiet, unpretentious, working-class dignity of the man who had, in every way that truly mattered, raised her, nurtured her, and shown her the meaning of unconditional love. To the untrained, casual, or perhaps simply indifferent eye, Malcolm Harper appeared entirely, almost serenely unaffected by this relentless, insidious barrage of silent and not-so-silent contempt. He had, after all, weathered these insidious, chilling storms of quiet, social disdain for many, many years, developing out of necessity a stoic, almost impenetrable facade that rarely, if ever, cracked under the pressure of their scrutiny. He would stand, invariably polite, always reserved, his gaze often fixed on some distant, unidentifiable point across the room, or perhaps on some internal landscape invisible to others, as if the barbs, the slights, the looks of dismissal simply couldn't penetrate his calm, unruffled exterior, as if they glanced off an invisible shield of inner peace. But Lena, his Lena, knew better. She who had studied his every subtle nuance, his every fleeting micro-expression, his every almost imperceptible shift in posture or mood for as long as she could remember. for as long as he had been the steady sun in her often cloudy sky, saw the minute, almost invisible, yet profoundly telling tells. The almost imperceptible momentary clench of his strong jawline, a fleeting, almost shadow-like tightening around his kind, patient eyes. The way his hands, usually so steady, so capable, might fidget ever so slightly, almost restlessly within the comforting, concealing confines of his pockets. These were the microscopic hairline cracks in his carefully, painstakingly maintained armor of composure, visible only to her discerning, loving gaze, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the hurt he so diligently, so consistently tried to conceal, especially from her, always wanting to protect her from the ugliness of such prejudice. Adding to Lena's quiet, internal anguish on this day that should have been purely joyful, was the conspicuous, glaring, and deeply felt absence of her own mother. Another graduation, another significant, once-in-a-lifetime milestone in Lena's young life, and yet another flimsy, almost insulting, excuse for her non-attendance. "Oh, darling, it's just too far to travel, you understand, don't you?" had been the breezy, dismissive explanation offered over a crackling, impersonal phone line, though the flight from her mother's comfortable, well-appointed Connecticut home to Northwood University was a mere 2 hours, a negligible, almost trivial journey for an event of this profound personal magnitude, an event any truly engaged parent would move heaven and earth to witness. But Malcolm, without a single moment's hesitation, without a word of complaint or a hint of martyrdom, had driven 7 arduous, monotonous, and physically demanding hours straight through the preceding ink-black night, battling soul-crushing fatigue and endless, hypnotic stretches of interstate highway, fueled by nothing more than lukewarm black coffee from a battered thermos and his unwavering, deeply ingrained determination to be there for Lena, to witness her moment of triumph, to share in her pride. He had arrived at dawn, tired but smiling that warm, reassuring smile of his eyes crinkling at the corners, with no word of complaint, no hint of the considerable sacrifice his solitary journey had entailed. And this thinly veiled, casually cruel disdain from the Crowleys. This was his unspoken, unacknowledged reward. To be treated not as a cherished, respected family member, not as the devoted, loving father figure he so clearly, so undeniably was, but as an inconvenient, embarrassing shadow, an unfortunate, socially awkward appendage. A regrettable social misstep to be tolerated with strained politeness, rather than embraced with genuine warmth. It was a bitter, acrid pill for Lena to swallow, watching the man who had so patiently, so lovingly, shaped her world, her values, her very understanding of kindness and integrity, be so casually, so cruelly, so publicly diminished by those who should have known better, by those who claimed to be her family. He never, not once, in all the years she had known him, spoke directly to Lena of the myriad slights he endured, the countless dismissive glances that slid past him as if he were made of air, as if he were utterly invisible, the whispered, cutting insults that were clearly meant to sting, and undoubtedly, despite his stoic exterior, did. He absorbed them, it seemed, with a quiet, almost heartbreaking, and profoundly dignified grace, shielding Lena, as best he could, from their full, unadulterated, toxic impact, always attempting, with a fierce, protective instinct, to preserve her joy, her innocence, on days that should have been untainted by such pervasive, unnecessary pettiness. But each unspoken insult, each disdainful, appraising look, each pointed, exclusionary remark that Lena witnessed, that she felt in the very marrow of her bones, was like a tiny, sharp, invisible paper cut on her own heart, accumulating relentlessly over the years, layering one upon another, until they formed a vast internal landscape of quiet, simmering sorrow and a fierce, almost volcanic, protective anger on his behalf, an anger she rarely dared to voice, but which burned within her nonetheless. His touch, when it finally came, as it always did when he sensed her distress, was nothing short of a lifeline, a tangible connection to sanity and strength in a sea of social discomfort. As Lena felt herself teetering precariously on the brink of either undignified tears or an uncharacteristic, explosive outburst of long-suppressed frustration, Malcolm's calloused, warm hand, a hand that knew the intimate meaning of hard, honest physical work, a hand that had mended so many of her childhood toys and later soothed so many of her teenage heartaches, would gently, unobtrusively cover hers where it rested, tense and white-knuckled, on her lap or on the table. It was a touch as light, as delicate as a falling feather, yet it possessed the unyielding, reassuring strength of tempered, unbreakable steel, a silent, instantaneous, grounding force that invariably, miraculously, pulled her back from the precipice of her roiling emotions, anchoring her once more to the present moment, to his unwavering calm. And then, as if summoned from the ether by that simple, profoundly reassuring physical contact, the memories, a torrent of them, would come flooding in, unbidden but always welcome, always fortifying, not in coherent, ordered, chronological sentences, but in vivid, luminous, almost cinematic snapshots, a deeply personal, internal cascade of moments from her past, each one a radiant, irrefutable testament to the true, unassailable character of the man they, in their ignorance and their arrogance, so casually, so cruelly, so consistently dismissed. These memories were her private sanctuary, her unshakable truth, the unassailable, incontrovertible evidence of his immeasurable worth, a worth that transcended any superficial societal metric. Memories, potent, vivid, and deeply visceral, played behind Lena's tightly closed eyelids, each one a meticulously rendered, emotionally resonant brushstroke in the rich, complex, and deeply cherished portrait of the man who was, in every conceivable way that truly mattered, more of a loving, present, and dedicated father to her than her biological one, the one who shared her DNA but little else, could ever have claimed, or even, it seemed, had ever aspired to be. These were not grand, sweeping, heroic sagas in the conventional, cinematic sense, not tales of daring rescues or public accolades, at least not the ones she knew of then. Instead, they formed a precious, intimate collection of small, consistent, often mundane, yet profoundly significant acts of love, patience, unwavering support, and quiet, everyday heroism that, when woven together with the threads of time and affection, formed the very fabric of her upbringing, the unshakable bedrock of her emotional security, the moral compass by which she navigated her own life. He didn't need her to articulate her myriad childhood fears, the monster under the bed, the first day of school, the intimidating darkness of the hallway at night. He didn't require her to stumble through explanations of her complex teenage anxieties, the shifting allegiances of friendships, the sting of social rejection, the overwhelming pressure of academic expectations. He didn't demand tearful, detailed confessions of her unspoken, often unacknowledged disappointments. He just knew, with an almost preternatural, deeply empathetic intuition, a true father's profound, almost telepathic understanding that transcended the clumsy inadequacy of words. He always knew when she was hurting, when she was struggling, when she was lost in a fog of confusion, when she simply needed his quiet, non-judgmental strength to lean on, his calm presence to steady her. He possessed an uncanny, almost magical ability to read the subtle, unspoken language of her moods, the shifting landscapes of her emotions, the silent, often hidden, narratives that played out in the depths of her expressive eyes, narratives she often couldn't articulate even to herself. He championed her dreams, both the grand, ambitious ones and the small, fleeting, almost whimsical ones, with an enthusiasm that was utterly, delightfully infectious, a pure, unadulterated, almost childlike belief in her inherent potential that often far outstripped her own tentative, self-doubting assessments of her capabilities. Whether it was a daunting school play in which she had but a single trembling line, a fledgling, hesitant attempt at writing a poignant short story, or her ambitious, nerve-wracking application to the prestigious halls of Northwood University, Malcolm was invariably her most ardent, her most vocal, her most unwavering cheerleader. He celebrated her victories, no matter how seemingly minor or insignificant they might have appeared to the rest of the indifferent world, as if they were his own deeply personal, hard-won triumphs. His kind face alight with a pride that was both fiercely protected and incredibly tender, a pride that enveloped her like a warm, comforting blanket. And just as readily, just as patiently, just as lovingly, he mended her world when it inevitably fractured. When life delivered its inevitable blows and disappointments, he did this one small, patient, often unnoticed act of kindness at a time. From meticulously fixing a beloved, broken toy in the innocent days of her early childhood, to offering a patient, non-judgmental, listening ear during the tumultuous, heart-wrenching sagas of teenage heartbreaks and betrayals, his steady, reassuring presence, a constant, soothing, healing balm on the raw wounds of her young, vulnerable spirit. He never once, in all their years together, overtly tried to replace her absent biological father, never attempted to step into shoes that were not his own by birthright. He never spoke ill of the man who had chosen to abandon them, who had walked away from his responsibilities without a backward glance. There was no attempt on Malcolm's part to usurp a title that wasn't legally his, no effort to rewrite the painful, inconvenient history of her fractured family. Instead, Malcolm simply, quietly, consistently, and with a love that was as vast and as constant as the sky itself, filled the gaping, aching void that her father's abrupt, unexplained departure had torn into the fabric of Lena's young, impressionable life. He filled it not with grand promises or empty platitudes, but with unwavering, tangible presence, with steadfast, unconditional, and non-performative love, with the quiet, unspoken yet deeply felt promise that she was never, ever truly alone, no matter what challenges life hurled her way, no matter how lost or frightened she might feel. He showed up. That was his unassuming yet utterly extraordinary, almost sacred superpower. For every school event, from the triumphant to the mundane, for every nerve-wracking doctor's or dentist's appointment, for every late-night, caffeine-fueled study session when she was overwhelmed by exams and deadlines, for every moment of crippling self-doubt or paralyzing fear, for every tear shed in frustration or sorrow, Malcolm just showed up. Consistently, reliably, lovingly, without fail, without complaint, without ever asking for anything in return. His presence was the one constant in her often chaotic world. Lena's eyes, even now, standing amidst the polite, superficial chatter and the clinking champagne flutes of the bustling, opulent reception hall, began to burn with the familiar hot sting of unshed, deeply emotional tears as these memories, so vivid, so precious, so intensely personal, washed over her in a powerful, overwhelming wave. She blinked rapidly, several times, a small, almost involuntary gesture, attempting to clear her vision, to push back the tide of emotion that threatened to engulf her. Her gaze, when it refocused, returned to the present, to Malcolm standing steadfastly, patiently, beside her, a quiet island of calm in the surrounding social storm. His thrift store suit, though impeccably clean, smelling faintly of sunshine and detergent, and pressed with meticulous care by his own hand that very morning, was undeniably, unmistakably, a testament to a life lived with frugality, a life without excess, a life where every dollar was earned through honest, often grueling labor. His gentle, almost understated strength, a quiet, profound resilience that had weathered countless personal storms, countless societal slights, without ever succumbing to bitterness or cynicism. His unwavering, intrinsic dignity, a quality that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being, a dignity that was utterly impervious to the petty, superficial judgments of others. A dignity that could not be bought, sold, or diminished by external circumstances. In this opulent, almost ostentatious setting, surrounded by the glittering, often intimidating trappings of inherited wealth and established social privilege, he looked to the superficial, unseeing eye, so utterly, almost painfully out of place. The contrast between his simple, unpretentious attire and the polished, gleaming marble floors, the glittering imported crystal champagne flutes, the hushed tones of old money, was stark, almost jarring. Yet to Lena, in that moment of profound, almost spiritual internal reflection, a moment of seeing him with fresh, unclouded eyes, he had never looked more right, more intrinsically noble, more perfectly, authentically, beautifully himself. His quiet, unassuming authenticity was a beacon of genuine humanity in a room that felt at times suffocatingly, almost oppressively artificial. A room where appearances often mattered more than substance. The cruel, carelessly flung words, particularly her Aunt Carol's deliberately barbed, insinuating question about her real father. A question designed not to elicit information, but to inflict a subtle yet deeply felt wound, still hung heavy and unwelcome in the air around Lena, a toxic, invisible, almost suffocating residue that threatened to poison her hard-won, fragile joy on this day of significant personal achievement. But as she looked at Malcolm, truly, deeply looked at him, seeing not just the man standing beside her in a slightly too large suit, but the vast, intricate, awe-inspiring sum of all his selfless acts, all his quiet sacrifices, all his unwavering kindnesses over so many years, a profound, almost revelatory and deeply liberating realization bloomed with sudden, unexpected force in the fertile soil of her chest. Powerfully, decisively, pushing aside the lingering hurt, the familiar sting of their casual cruelty, the people uttering those judgmental, dismissive words, the ones so quick, so eager to categorize, to label and to dismiss based on the flimsiest of outward, superficial appearances. They simply didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They were, in a way, blind. They had no genuine concept, no experiential framework for understanding the true, profound meaning of the word real, when it applied to human connection, to love, to family. They had no grasp of genuine, selfless sacrifice, of unwavering, unconditional loyalty, of the quiet, persistent, everyday heroism that was the very essence, the defining characteristic, the moral signature of Malcolm Harper. He had never needed a biological tie, a piece of paper from a courthouse, a legally binding document, or a societally sanctioned title to be a true, devoted, and exceptional father to her. He had simply, consistently, wholeheartedly, and with every fiber of his being, chosen to be one, every single day, in every meaningful, impactful way, for as long as she could possibly remember, a choice he reaffirmed with every patient word, every supportive gesture, every quiet act of love. The main graduation ceremony, held within the imposing, acoustically perfect, and historically significant confines of the university's grand auditorium, began its stately, time-honored procession. Names representing years of dedication and intellectual pursuit were called out, one by one, each resonating with a unique story of effort and aspiration. Degrees, symbolizing not just academic achievement, but also personal growth and future potential, were formally, ceremoniously conferred by the university dignitaries, and futures, seemingly bright with the promise of academic achievement and boundless opportunity, were, in that symbolic moment, ceremoniously, optimistically launched into the waiting world. Lena's name, Lena Anya Harper, had been called earlier in the meticulously orchestrated proceedings, her voice clear and steady as she accepted her honors. She was recognized, with distinction, for her outstanding, consistently excellent academic achievements, a distinction she had worked tirelessly, often late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination to achieve. A goal she had pursued not for external validation, but for her own deep-seated desire to learn and to grow. That particular moment, hearing her name echo through the vast hall, seeing her walk across the stage, had been one of pure, unadulterated, almost overwhelming pride for Malcolm. His quiet, heartfelt applause, emanating from his seat a few rows back, almost hidden amongst the larger, more boisterous family groups, had been largely, almost completely, drowned out by the more demonstrative, vociferous, and sometimes ostentatious cheers of other, more uninhibited families. But for Lena, his understated, almost private clap, the radiant, almost beatific smile that had illuminated his kind face, transforming it with pure joy, had meant infinitely more than all the other accolades, all the polite congratulations, all the formal recognitions combined. It was his approval, his quiet, unwavering pride in her that she cherished most deeply, that validated her efforts more profoundly than any diploma or honor society induction. The university chancellor, Dr. Alara Vance, a distinguished academic and a woman widely known and respected for her genuine warmth, her profound dedication to the student body, and her progressive vision for the institution, continued with the carefully planned program of events. With grace and eloquence, she announced various prestigious scholarships, significant, often transformative, endowments from philanthropic alumni, and the names of prominent, influential donors whose considerable generosity played a vital role in supporting the university's mission of education, research, and community engagement. With each resonant mention of a recognizable, historically wealthy, and socially prominent family name, names that often grace the society pages of glossy magazines, the letterheads of major, city-defining corporations, or the plaques on university buildings, the Crowley contingent, strategically seated a few rows behind Lena and Malcolm, their presence a constant, low-level irritant, would erupt in a display of almost comically performative, overly enthusiastic approval. Their applause was invariably just a little too loud, a little too sustained, their collective nods of solemn, knowing approval a little too vigorous, a little too self-congratulatory. And their eyes, with a predictability that Lena found both infuriating and deeply saddening, would invariably, and with pointed, almost theatrical significance, flicker towards Malcolm, as if to silently, cruelly, underscore his perceived and, in their minds, absolute insignificance in this rarefied, exclusive world of inherited influence, vast affluence, and deeply entrenched old money social standing. Each of these fleeting, yet heavily freighted glances was a fresh, subtle, yet deeply wounding insult, a silent, ongoing reminder of their unwavering, uncharitable judgment, a judgment based on nothing more than his skin color, his modest attire, and his lack of a prestigious surname. Then a subtle but perceptible shift occurred. The Chancellor, Dr. Vance, paused in her formal announcements. She smiled, a genuine, almost conspiratorial, warm smile that seemed to signal a distinct, welcome departure from the more formal, predictable rhythm of the proceedings. It was a smile that held a hint of pleasant, intriguing anticipation, a subtle promise of something unexpected, something perhaps even extraordinary, about to unfold. The atmosphere in the vast, crowded auditorium, already charged with a potent cocktail of emotions, pride, relief, nostalgia, and hope, seemed to subtly yet definitively change. A new, almost electric current of heightened interest, of piqued curiosity, rippling palpably through the assembled, expectant guests, from the front rows occupied by dignitaries to the very back rows filled with excited families. A palpable, almost tangible ripple of intrigue, of heightened expectation, spread like a wave through the diverse audience. Students, moments away from officially becoming alumni, exchanged curious, speculative glances with their equally intrigued parents and friends. Lena, preternaturally sensitive to these subtle atmospheric shifts, these unspoken collective emotions, felt the fine, almost invisible hairs on her arms rise in an involuntary, almost primitive response to the sudden, charged, almost pregnant stillness that had descended upon the hall. Even the incessant, grating, critical whispers emanating from the Crowley row directly behind her momentarily, blessedly quietened. Their usual disdain, their reflexive condescension, momentarily supplanted, it seemed, by a shared, if somewhat grudging, and certainly uncharacteristic, curiosity about what unexpected, unscripted announcement might possibly be forthcoming. The very air in the auditorium seemed thick, almost viscous, with unspoken questions, with a collective, indrawn breath of anticipation. The name Malcolm Harper, spoken with clarity, respect, and a profound, unmistakable warmth by Chancellor Vance, echoed through the vast, hushed auditorium, amplified by the state-of-the-art, crystal-clear sound system, yet somehow carrying an intimate, deeply personal, almost startling weight. It seemed to hang suspended in the suddenly still air for a long, breathless moment, a stunning, entirely unexpected, almost paradigm-shifting pronouncement that had the immediate, visceral effect of shattering into a million irreparable fragments the carefully constructed, deeply ingrained prejudices, the smug, unexamined, unspoken assumptions that had permeated, poisoned, and defined the Crowley family's condescending interactions with him for so many painful, frustrating years. Malcolm Harper, the quiet, unassuming man in the slightly too large, undeniably inexpensive suit. The man they had so easily, so consistently, so cruelly dismissed as inconsequential. The man they had so casually, so arrogantly, derided as being socially beneath them. The man they had so consistently, so determinedly deemed invisible or even worse, a social embarrassment, a regrettable blight on their carefully curated family image. The man they had whispered, with casual, unthinking cruelty, was probably there merely to clean up the discarded remnants of the grand celebration. That very man, their Malcolm, Lena's Malcolm, was now in this astonishing, almost surreal moment, the one being publicly, profoundly, and unequivocally honored, his simple, unpretentious name resonating through the hallowed hall with an unforeseen, undeniable importance, a weight of significance that none of them, least of all the Crowleys, could ever have possibly conceived or remotely anticipated. Period. The insidious, relentless whispers, which had been a constant, grating, almost unbearable soundtrack to Lena's every interaction with her mother's side of the family, for as long as she could remember, stopped. Abruptly, utterly, completely, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging that corner of the auditorium into an uncharacteristic, almost unnerving silence. The condescending, self-satisfied smirks that had been virtually plastered, like permanent fixtures, on the carefully made-up faces of Aunt Carol and Cousin Tiffany vanished as if wiped away by an invisible divine hand, leaving behind expressions of slack-jawed, almost comical disbelief. In their place, a stunning, almost theatrical tableau of raw, unfiltered, and deeply revealing reactions. Stunned, almost catatonic disbelief etched on every Crowley face. Wide-eyed, uncomprehending confusion, warring with a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. And for some, Lena fervently, desperately hoped, a nascent, burgeoning, and deeply uncomfortable flicker of shame, of profound regret, as the full, unvarnished implications of the Chancellor's heartfelt, laudatory words began to penetrate their carefully constructed, heavily fortified walls of complacency and self-congratulation. The world, as they knew it, as they and so confidently defined it, had in that single electrifying moment been irrevocably, spectacularly turned on its head, its comfortable certainties shattered beyond repair. Malcolm, meanwhile, standing unobtrusively, almost self-effacingly, near the back wall of the auditorium, as was his invariable habit in such large, formal, and potentially intimidating gatherings, appeared momentarily utterly frozen, his usual humble, almost deferential posture giving way to a visible, almost palpable startle, a slight involuntary recoil, as if from an unexpected physical blow. His eyes, usually so calm, so observant, so patiently taking in the world around him, were now fixed, with an almost painful intensity, on Dean Miller, who had moved gracefully to a side podium, ready to elaborate on the award. A flicker of something utterly unreadable. Profound surprise, certainly. Perhaps a touch of genuine, bewildered apprehension, or maybe just profound, overwhelming disbelief, danced in their kind, honest depths. He seemed, for a fleeting, almost suspended second, as utterly bewildered, as completely taken aback as everyone else in the stunned, silent auditorium by this sudden, glaring, and entirely unanticipated public focus. A spotlight he had never sought and indeed had actively avoided his entire life. Lena's heart, which just moments before had been a tumultuous, churning maelstrom of conflicting emotions, justifiable pride in her own significant academic achievements, warring with a deep, simmering, almost visceral resentment towards her judgmental relatives, began to pound with a new, almost violent and entirely different rhythm, a rhythm of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, almost unbearable hope. A wild, improbable, almost fantastical thought, a terrifying, exhilarating, almost dizzying suspicion began to take tentative, then firmer, root in the fertile, astonished ground of her shocked, reeling mind. The Chancellor, in her introductory remarks for the special award, had mentioned that the recipient had a child graduating that very day with top honors. That undeniably was her. The Chancellor had also spoken, with genuine admiration, of extensive, often anonymous, community service, of quiet, unassuming inspiration, of a life lived in selfless dedication to others. Could it possibly be? Could they truly be talking about her Malcolm in this extraordinary, almost unbelievable context? He was her rock, her steadfast supporter, her quiet confidant, the calm center of her often turbulent world, but a public hero? A recipient of such a prestigious, unexpected university honor. The idea was so utterly foreign, so completely at odds with the humble, unassuming, almost invisible man she knew and loved, that her mind, her logical, rational mind, struggled almost physically to grasp it, to accept it as a possibility, even as a tiny, tenacious, almost desperate sliver of incandescent hope began to pierce through the thick, disorienting fog of her initial, overwhelming disbelief. A hope that was so potent, it almost hurt. There was a profound, almost sacred stillness in the air now, a hushed, collective reverence that only ever follows the speaking of a deep, unvarnished, and universally resonant truth. The kind of transformative truth that possesses the inherent, almost alchemical power to recalibrate one's entire perception of an individual, of a situation, or even, in rare instances, of the world itself and one's place within it. It was the kind of profound, pin-drop silence that compels introspection, that makes you reevaluate everything you thought you knew with certainty, every judgment you had ever casually made, every unexamined assumption you had ever comfortably held. The collective breath of the entire vast auditorium seemed to be held in a state of suspended, almost painful anticipation, waiting with a mixture of awe and trepidation for the next revelation, for the unfolding of a story that everyone sensed was about to become legendary. In that single, transformative, almost incandescent moment, as Malcolm Harper, the man they knew, the man they thought they knew, the man whose quiet presence had been so easily, so consistently overlooked, began his slow, hesitant, almost reluctant walk from the shadows at the back of the hall towards the brightly lit, expectant stage, the very fabric of perception, the collective understanding of worth and heroism, seemed to alter, to shift, to realign itself before their very eyes. The faded, undeniably inexpensive thrift store blazer he wore, the very same garment that had been the silent, unacknowledged subject of so much unspoken, disdainful scorn from the Crowleys and perhaps others, suddenly, miraculously, seemed to acquire the inherent dignity, the understated gravitas, of a king's ceremonial robe. His well-worn, meticulously polished dress shoes, scuffed not from fashionable affectation, but from years of honest, uncomplaining labor, from countless miles walked in service to others, appeared in that revelatory light as noble, as honorable, as a warrior's battle-tested boots. The man they had so cruelly, so consistently, so casually mocked, the man they had so arrogantly, so dismissively, so definitively dismissed as just the stepfather, an outsider, an unfortunate, embarrassing attachment to their otherwise respectable family, was now, against all conceivable odds, against all their prejudiced expectations, standing where true, authentic, unassuming heroes belong, bathed in the warm, affirming, almost consecrating glow of the stage lights. His story, his true, hidden, and now astonishingly public story, finally, irrevocably, and with breathtaking impact, about to be told to a stunned, captivated world that had, until this very electrifying, paradigm-shifting moment, been tragically, unforgivably blind to his quiet, unassuming, yet utterly profound magnificence. A magnificence that had been there all along, waiting patiently to be seen. The return to the reception hall after the main ceremony had concluded, and after the earth-shattering, almost unbelievable revelations about Malcolm's hidden life of heroism and selfless community service had been publicly unveiled, was akin to entering an entirely different, almost surreal dimension, a parallel universe where the established, deeply entrenched social hierarchies, the unspoken rules of status and deference, had been utterly, irrevocably, and spectacularly upended. The incessant, insidious whispers, those venomous, judgmental undercurrents of disdain that had previously characterized the atmosphere whenever Malcolm was near, were entirely, blessedly gone, replaced by a stunned, almost reverent, and deeply uncomfortable silence that fell like a heavy blanket whenever Malcolm and Lena, now walking with a newfound, shared confidence, passed by a group of assembled guests. Eyes that had previously, and with casual indifference, slid over Malcolm as if he were a piece of unremarkable furniture, or worse, completely invisible, now followed him with a potent, almost palpable mixture of awe, profound curiosity, and for many, particularly those who had been complicit in the earlier mockery, a deeply unsettling, almost palpable discomfort. The delicate, often invisible, balance of power, so cruelly, so unfairly skewed just a few short hours before, had irrevocably, dramatically, and with a satisfying sense of poetic justice, shifted, realigned by the undeniable weight of truth and the revelation of true, unassuming character. 3 simple, unadorned, almost stark words. You didn't ask. There was no hint of vindication sought or found in his calm, steady tone, no trace of gloating triumph, no lingering, bitter residue of an "I told you so," hanging heavy in the suddenly quiet, charged air between them. Just the plain, unvarnished, undeniable, and almost unbearable weight of simple truth, offered without a trace of malice, without a hint of accusation, yet carrying within its very simplicity a moral force far more devastating, far more shame-inducing, far more effective in its quiet power than any shouted, angry retort or lengthy, accusatory confrontation could ever have possibly achieved. It was a gentle, almost understated indictment of their prejudice, their lack of curiosity, their willful blindness, and it was all the more powerful, all the more cutting, for its profound, almost heartbreaking restraint. It left the usually verbose, perpetually self-assured Crowleys, utterly, uncharacteristically speechless, stripped bare of their customary armor of arrogance and condescension, their faces a mixture of disbelief, dawning shame, and a new, unwelcome, and deeply unsettling respect for the man they had so grievously misjudged for so very long. They walked together then, Lena's arm linked firmly, proudly, almost defiantly, through Malcolm's strong, reassuring one. A silent, powerful statement of solidarity and love that needed no words to convey its depth and its permanence. They moved with a newfound, shared grace past the imposing, cold marble columns that seemed to stand as silent, impassive witnesses to the day's extraordinary, almost unbelievable sequence of events. They walked past the stunned, now universally respectful, faces of their fellow graduates and their equally astonished families, past the very same people who just a short, yet eternally significant, time ago had so easily, so carelessly, so cruelly labeled him the help, or had mistaken him with casual, unthinking disdain for a mere driver, or had simply, in their blinkered, superficial judgment, deemed him unworthy of their notice, of their consideration, of their basic human respect. Malcolm's steps, which had seemed understandably hesitant, almost reluctant, on his unexpected journey to the brightly lit stage, were now remarkably light. Almost buoyant, as if a great, heavy, unseen burden, a weight he had carried silently, stoically, for far too many years, had finally, blessedly, been lifted from his broad, deserving shoulders. Lena's head was held high, her chin tilted with a quiet, dignified confidence, her earlier tension, her gnawing anxiety, completely vanquished, replaced by a radiant, unassailable, almost fierce pride in the man beside her, a pride that shone from her like an inner light. Neither of them, not once, looked back at the receding, diminished figures of the Crowleys, who seemed to shrink in stature as they departed, nor did they acknowledge the curious, now almost reverent, stares of the other guests who lined their path. There were no more whispers, no more snide remarks, no more judgmental glances that followed them as they made their exit from the grand hall. Only a profound, contemplative, almost awestruck silence, and the fading, rhythmic, reassuring sound of their footsteps, walking in unison as they left the scene of both their private pain and their public vindication, leaving behind a roomful of chastened, reflective people to ponder, perhaps for the first time with genuine depth, the true, often hidden, nature of human greatness, and the profound, often tragic, fallibility of their own unexamined, preconceived judgments. For in that quiet, dignified, and ultimately triumphant departure, even the most judgmental, the most cynical, the most hardened among them, those who had been quickest to condemn and slowest to understand, learned a valuable, if undeniably uncomfortable, and perhaps even life-altering lesson, that true, authentic, enduring greatness, the kind that genuinely changes lives, the kind that inspires hope, the kind that leaves an indelible mark on the world, doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard above the din of superficiality. It doesn't require the external, often fleeting, validation of expensive designer labels, nor the societal affirmation of a prestigious inherited address, nor does it typically announce its arrival with a self-congratulatory blare of trumpets or any form of ostentatious, attention-seeking fanfare. Sometimes, perhaps more often than our cynical world would have us believe, it walks quietly, almost invisibly, beside us, cloaked in the simple, unassuming, and often overlooked attire of a faded, hand-me-down blazer and a pair of well-worn, lovingly polished shoes. Its profound, intrinsic worth is easily, tragically, unnoticed, its deep, resonant depth unplumbed, unappreciated by the casual, hurried, superficial glance of the world too often obsessed with surfaces, until that singular, pivotal, almost divinely ordained moment when its inherent, undeniable light, its irrefutable, unshakable truth becomes too brilliantly, too powerfully, too magnificently, too undeniably bright to ignore any longer, illuminating not only itself, but also the shadows of ignorance and prejudice that had previously obscured it from view. Back in the quiet, comforting, almost sacred sanctuary of their modest, yet lovingly kept and meticulously clean home, far removed from the opulent grandeur, the social pressures, and the intense, almost overwhelming emotional turbulence of the university grounds, the lingering echoes of the vast auditorium, the thunderous, sustained applause that had felt like a physical force, the shocked, collective gasps of disbelief, the chancellor's heartfelt, deeply moving words of praise, began gradually to fade, to recede into the realm of extraordinary memory. They were replaced, thankfully, by a familiar, deeply comforting, and soul-soothing peace, the kind of profound, restorative quiet that settles only in well-loved, well-lived-in spaces, a silence rich not with emptiness, but with unspoken understanding, shared history, and the comfortable rhythms of a life lived with integrity and mutual affection. The late afternoon sunlight, now softer, more mellow, more golden as the day began its slow descent towards evening, streamed lazily, almost tenderly, through the freshly cleaned panes of the living room windows, casting long, elegant, dancing shadows across the polished, time-worn wooden floor, illuminating countless, normally invisible dust motes that swirled and eddied in its gentle, ethereal rays, each one a tiny, sparkling universe unto itself. It was a quiet, almost reverent, deeply personal act of elevation, a subtle, yet profoundly significant, almost sacred coronation that had been years, indeed a lifetime, in the making, a culmination of countless unseen acts of love and sacrifice. It was a private, domestic acknowledgement of a very public and entirely unexpected honor, seamlessly, beautifully, bringing the extraordinary, almost unbelievable events of the day into the warm, familiar, cherished heart of their ordinary, yet deeply meaningful, everyday life. The true, intrinsic measure of the man, his quiet strength, his hidden heroism, finally, tangibly reflected where it had always, in Lena's heart, belonged, in the very center of their shared home, in the undisputed, honored center of her grateful, overflowing heart, a permanent, visible testament to the truth that had finally been revealed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a profound, almost blissful sense of peace, of resolution, of burdens lifted, settled over Lena, enveloping her like the softest, most comforting embrace. There was absolutely nothing left to prove, no one left to convince, no more battles to be fought in the wearying war against prejudice and misunderstanding. Not to her mother's perpetually critical, status-obsessed side of the family, whose fleeting, conditional approval she had long ago, and with considerable wisdom and self-preservation, stopped actively seeking, recognizing its ultimate futility and its emotional cost. Not to the dismissive, often cruel classmates of her youth, whose casual, unthinking cruelties, born of ignorance and insecurity, had once stung so sharply, leaving invisible scars on her young, vulnerable psyche. Not to anyone, absolutely anyone, in the wider, often indifferent or judgmental world. The undeniable, irrefutable truth of Malcolm's sterling character, his quiet, unassuming, yet profoundly impactful heroism, had been laid bare, dramatically and unequivocally, for all the world to see, and in that stunning, public revelation, Lena found a deep, resonant liberation, a sense of lightness, of unburdening, that she hadn't even fully realized she'd been so desperately, so consistently, craving for so many years. The world, or at least a significant, vocal, and now deeply impressed portion of it, had finally at long last seen, truly seen, if only for a fleeting, yet unforgettable moment, the magnificent, honorable, and deeply loving man she had always known, the unassuming, everyday hero she had always loved, cherished, and fiercely defended in the quiet chambers of her own heart. Life, in its relentless, often indifferent, yet ultimately comforting, ordinary rhythm, played on around them, seemingly oblivious to the extraordinary, life-altering events that had transpired just hours before, events that had reshaped perceptions and redefined legacies. Outside their small, welcoming window, the distant, joyful, carefree sounds of children laughing as they played with unrestrained abandon in a nearby sun-dappled park drifted softly on the gentle, caressing evening breeze, a timeless soundtrack to suburban life. A lawnmower, a few streets over, buzzed its monotonous, yet somehow reassuring, familiar song. A quintessential, almost comforting sound of a neighborhood settling into the routines of early summer. A neighborhood dog, unseen but clearly heard, barked intermittently with great self-important enthusiasm at a passing, equally indignant squirrel. A tiny, inconsequential, yet fiercely contested drama unfolding in the grand, indifferent scheme of things. And yet, within the quiet, unassuming walls of their simple, love-filled home, and deep within the most protected, most sacred recesses of Lena's grateful, overflowing heart, something fundamental, something profound, something utterly transformative, had irrevocably, beautifully, and permanently changed. Because now, the world, or at least a significant, vocal, and now deeply admiring portion of it, knew, with certainty, what Lena had always carried, always cherished, always fiercely, protectively guarded, within the deepest, most inviolable chambers of her loyal heart. That true, authentic, life-altering heroism doesn't always arrive dramatically announced by a deafening, triumphant blare of trumpets or accompanied by a swelling, emotionally manipulative, cinematic soundtrack. It doesn't always, or even usually, wear gleaming, ostentatious medals upon its proud chest for everyone to see, every single day, a constant, visible, almost boastful reminder of its past valor, its public acclaim. Sometimes, perhaps most often, in the quiet, unglamorous corners of everyday life, heroism wears the unassuming, almost invisible disguise of calloused, work-roughened hands. Hands softened not by expensive perfumed lotions bought in fancy department stores, but by years upon years of honest, uncomplaining, often physically demanding hard work. Hands that have patiently, skillfully fixed countless broken toys, leaky faucets, and more importantly, fractured spirits. It speaks. Not in booming, self-congratulatory pronouncements designed to capture attention, but in a quiet, gentle, almost hesitant voice. A voice that offers profound, unwavering comfort in times of deep, overwhelming sorrow. Clear, insightful wisdom in moments of bewildering, paralyzing confusion. And steadfast, unconditional encouragement in the face of crippling, insidious self-doubt. It shows up consistently, reliably, and without any need for fanfare or acknowledgement, as a steady, unwavering, utterly dependable presence through the scraped knees, the tearful disappointments, and the fleeting triumphs of childhood. Through the awkward, confusing, often painful navigations of adolescence, with its shifting friendships and its first tentative heartbreaks. Through the public triumphs and the private, crushing failures of school violin recitals and overly ambitious, ultimately broken science fair projects. And through the long, lonely, caffeine-fueled nights filled with the immense pressure of academic expectations, the fear of failure, and the daunting, existential weight of youthful doubt. Sometimes, perhaps most profoundly, heroism wears the familiar, beloved, and deeply reassuring face of a man who never once asked to be seen, who never sought the fleeting, seductive allure of the public spotlight, who actively shunned attention and praise, but who, when the moment of ultimate unforeseen testing came, and in countless small, unheralded, yet equally significant moments leading up to it, shone brighter, more authentically, more inspiringly, with a purer, more selfless light than anyone. A man who simply, profoundly, and consistently chose, every single day, with every conscious breath, to love, to protect, to nurture, to guide, and most heroically of all, to stay, when staying, in the face of indifference, prejudice, and personal sacrifice, was perhaps the hardest, the bravest, and the most profoundly heroic act of all. Malcolm Harper's extraordinary, yet in so many ways touchingly ordinary and deeply inspiring story serves as a potent, unforgettable, and universally resonant reminder for us all. A lesson whispered on the winds of human experience. Never, ever, under any circumstances, judge a book solely, or even primarily, by its deceptively simple, or perhaps misleadingly elaborate, cover. For the most profound, the most moving, the most life-changing narratives, the most inspiring, unforgettable characters are often, almost invariably, hidden beneath the most unassuming, the most easily overlooked of exteriors. True lasting worth, genuine, unshakable character, and enduring, impactful heroism lie not in the fleeting, superficial, and ultimately meaningless trappings of accumulated wealth, inherited status, or carefully cultivated physical appearance, but deep, deep within the unshakable, often tested, yet ultimately resilient and luminous core of the human spirit, a spirit capable of astonishing acts of courage, compassion, and selfless love, often when and where we least expect to find them. What were your initial, unfiltered thoughts, your deepest, most resonant feelings as you heard the intricate, poignant layers of Malcolm's incredible and in many ways deeply relatable story unfold before you? Has there been someone, perhaps many someones, in your own unique personal life, perhaps a devoted family member, a patient and insightful mentor, a loyal and steadfast friend, or even, on occasion, a kind, compassionate, and entirely unexpected stranger who has shown you, through their actions rather than their words, this kind of quiet, unassuming, yet profoundly impactful, everyday heroism? The kind of heroism that doesn't make the screaming headlines of the nightly news or trend on social media, but which in its quiet, persistent way profoundly shapes lives, mends broken hearts, and subtly, yet powerfully, makes the world a better, kinder, more hopeful place. These are the precious, often unacknowledged stories that frequently go untold, uncelebrated in the grand theater of public life, yet they form the true, unshakable bedrock of our communities, the invisible, yet incredibly strong threads of compassion, courage, resilience, and selfless love that bind us together as human beings, reminding us of our shared capacity for goodness. We would be genuinely honored, deeply moved, and profoundly grateful to hear about them, to share in the celebration of these unsung heroes who walk among us, making a difference, one quiet act of kindness at a time.